The whole checkout lane went quiet when the manager's voice cut across the noise of the store, sharp, final, the kind of voice that doesn't invite argument. A man in a green apron stood very still at register 4, and the silence that followed his firing was the particular kind of silence that belongs to witnesses, people who saw something happen but chose, for the moment, not to say so. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He reached up with both hands and unclipped the name badge from the front of his apron and set it on the conveyor belt with the same careful deliberateness he used for everything, and then he reached below the counter and lifted his daughter's backpack and held out his hand to her, and she took it. They were halfway to the door when it slid open. A woman walked in. She was wearing a charcoal coat that cost more than a month of Daniel Mercer's rent, and she moved through the entrance like someone who had never in her life been unsure of where she was going. Her eyes swept the checkout area once, the way a person looks when they already know roughly what they're going to find, and then her gaze settled on the man, with the green apron in his hands and the little girl at his side. Nobody in the store yet understood what was about to happen, but it was already in motion. The Mercer family's economy ran on precision. Daniel had worked out the math more times than he could count on paper napkins, on the back of grocery receipts, in his head during the 12-minute drive between the supermarket and the dry cleaning shop where he worked Thursday evenings and all day Saturday. The dry cleaning job paid $11 an hour, plus the occasional tip when a customer found extra change in a coat pocket and felt generous. The cashier job at Kellerman's Grocery paid $12.75. Together, if nothing unexpected happened, they covered rent on the 2-bedroom apartment on Aldrich Street, Cora's insulin, Lily's school lunches, the electric bill, and the car insurance. If nothing unexpected happened, things unexpected happened with some regularity. A tire blew out in November. The refrigerator died in March. Lily needed new shoes every 4 months because she was 8 years old and apparently growing at a rate that violated the normal laws of biology. Daniel handled these disruptions the way he handled most things, quietly, methodically, without complaint, by moving money around until the numbers balanced again. He had been doing this for 3 years, since Cora's condition had made working impossible, and she had moved back to her mother's house in Raleigh, leaving Daniel with Lily and a set of domestic arrangements that required a level of organizational effort most people reserved for running small companies. He did not think of himself as struggling. He thought of himself as managing. There had been a period, in the first year, when he had not managed particularly well. Not catastrophically, the bills got paid. Lily got fed. The routines held together in the way that routines do when you enforce them, even when you don't feel like it, because the enforcement is more important than the feeling. But he had been, underneath the surface of the maintaining, genuinely lost. He had thought about asking for help, and had not asked, because the asking itself felt like a further loss of ground. And he was already working hard enough just to hold what he had. He had gotten through it the way most people get through the first hard year of something, by getting through it one day at a time, and eventually discovering that the day count had become a month count, and then a year, and that along the way, without any single moment of clarity, the weight had shifted into something he could carry more naturally. The separation had been quiet, more exhausted than angry. Two people who had run out of bandwidth for each other before they ran out of affection. Cora called on Sundays and talked to Lily for 20 minutes about school and her drawings and what she was reading. And this was the shape their family had taken. And Daniel had decided, after a period of grief he did not discuss with anyone, that a shape chosen deliberately was better than one held together by obligation. He was 34 years old. He had Lily, and he had his jobs, and he had the apartment on Aldrich Street with its unreliable radiator, and its view of the parking garage, and its small kitchen where he cooked most evenings, and where Lily did her homework at the table, while he worked, and he had made a practice, deliberate and sustained, of finding this sufficient. Most days it was. Some days it required more effort. On this particular Friday, Lily was sitting in the chair. He kept behind, register 4. Technically, a violation of store policy. Technically, something Mr. Hargrove had told him twice not to do. Practically, the only solution available. When school let out at 3, and his shift didn't end until 6. She had her math workbook open on her knees and a pencil tucked behind her ear, and she was working through a section on long division with the focused intensity she brought to everything she found difficult. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, which Daniel considered a good combination. The Friday afternoon rush at Kellerman's had the quality of managed chaos carts jostling, children crying in the cereal aisle, the self-checkout machines issuing their endless complaints. Daniel worked with the efficiency of someone who had run this lane for 3 years. Scan, bag, total, thank you, next. He remembered regulars. He remembered that Mrs. Pulaski, in 14B, had a bad hip and needed the bags light. He remembered that the tall man with the Boston Terrier always forgot his loyalty card and needed it looked up. He did these things not because they were required of him, but because they cost him nothing and seemed to matter to people. Mr. Hargrove moved through the store the way a cold front moves you, knew he was there before you saw him, by the way people's postures changed. He was 51, with the build of a man who had been athletic once and had let it go to administrative weight, and he had the manager's particular talent for appearing at your side exactly when you were doing something he could document. He had never once complimented Daniel. He had written him up twice, once for the chair, once for spending 4 minutes helping an elderly customer find the right brand of blood pressure medication. Daniel had signed both write-ups without comment. The second write-up had particularly bothered him, not because he regretted the 4 minutes, but because of the way Hargrove had phrased it in the documentation. Employee deviated from assigned lane to assist customer with non-standard request, resulting in lane backup of approximately 6 minutes. The customer in question had been an 80-year-old man named Mr. Fenwick, who had been recently widowed and was doing his own grocery shopping for the first time in 42 years, and had stood in the pharmaceutical aisle holding 2 boxes of the same medication, trying to determine which one his doctor had actually prescribed. Daniel had walked him over, helped him read the labels against the prescription on his phone, confirmed the right one, and walked him back to the pharmacy counter to double-check. 6 minutes. Hargrove had made it sound like a liability. Daniel had not argued. He never argued with Hargrove, not because he lacked the capacity, but because he had understood early that the argument was not the point. The point was the job. And the job was how Lily ate lunch, and he was not in the position to sacrifice the practical for the satisfying. So he signed the write-up and filed it, and went back to register 4 and did his work. Lily looked up from her workbook when a cluster of customers arrived at the lane simultaneously, the way they always did, as if the store had been holding them in reserve. She watched her father work with the calm assessment of a child who has spent a lot of time observing adults. "Dad, Mem, you forgot to carry the one on the problem I was doing. Look." He glanced over between customers, looked at her notebook, and nodded. "You're right. Fix it." She fixed it. He scanned a case of sparkling water. The afternoon moved forward. She came through the automatic doors at 4:47, and Daniel noticed her the way he noticed most things in the store peripherally. Cataloging without commentary. She was in her mid-70s, small in the particular way of women who have been losing height gradually for a decade without noticing, dressed in a brown wool coat with large buttons and sensible shoes, and a canvas tote bag that said Rosewood Public Library on the side. She had white hair pinned up with 2 clips, and a face that suggested she had spent most of her life outdoors. She moved through the store with the deliberate pace of someone working from a list she had memorized rather than written down, pausing at the canned goods section, pausing again at the dairy case, taking her time in the bread aisle in a way that made the younger shoppers flow around her like water around a stone. She did not appear to notice the inconvenience she caused. Or perhaps she had simply reached the age where she no longer felt obligated to apologize for taking up space. There was a quality about elderly people shopping alone that Daniel had noticed over 3 years at the register. A particular self-containedness that was either moving or heartbreaking depending on the day. They knew exactly what they wanted. They had planned the trip. They had their list, mental or physical, and they worked through it without the distracted improvisation of younger shoppers who arrived at the register with items they had put in the cart on impulse and were only now deciding whether to actually buy. The elderly shoppers had already made their decisions, at home, at the kitchen table, with a cup of coffee, and the deliberateness of people who were careful, because their circumstances required care. Eleanor was this kind of shopper. She moved with purpose and without waste. She arrived at Daniel's Lane at 5:09 with a handbasket containing a carton of eggs, a small container of plain yogurt, a loaf of whole wheat bread, a bunch of carrots, a can of chicken broth, and a box of chamomile tea. She set these items on the belt with the methodical care of someone used to doing things properly, then opened her purse. These were not extravagant items. They were the items of a person who planned meals carefully and wasted nothing, the broth and carrots suggesting soup, the bread to go alongside it, the eggs for breakfast through the week. Daniel noticed things like this, not out of habit exactly, but out of the specific attentiveness of someone who had spent years managing his own economy and recognized the same effort in others. Daniel scanned the items and bagged them in paper. "Good evening," he said. "Good evening, young man." He told her the total. She looked at her wallet, and something shifted in her expression, not distress exactly, more the careful recalibration of someone doing arithmetic they hadn't expected to need. She had cash, a small amount, and a debit card. And she tried the debit card first, and it declined. And she tried it a second time in case the first time had been an error, and it declined again, and she stood very still for a moment, looking at the card. "I'm sorry," she said. "I think I've made a mistake with my account." I was certain I had enough. The man behind her in line, mid-30s, suit jacket, phone in hand, shifted his weight and exhaled audibly. The woman directly behind him glanced at the next lane. The old woman began removing items from the bags. "The tea? I don't need that. And the yogurt?" "No, please," Daniel said. She looked up at him. "It's fine. I've got it." She began to protest, and he shook his head once, not unkindly. He had $11 and change in his wallet from yesterday's lunch that he hadn't spent. He counted out what was needed and set it in the drawer. The transaction completed. The woman stood holding her bags with an expression Daniel had seen before, in the faces of people who were unused to receiving help and didn't quite know what to do with it. "What's your name, young man?" "Daniel." She nodded slowly, as if committing this to memory. "Daniel. My name is Eleanor. You have a good heart." She paused, then said something he would think about later. "My daughter worries about me, you know. She thinks I don't manage well on my own. But I manage perfectly fine. I just had a moment." "Everyone has moments," Daniel said. She smiled a real smile, the kind that uses the eyes, and lifted her bags and walked slowly toward the exit. He did not see the camera mounted above the service desk swivel almost imperceptibly. He did not notice the small notification that went, via the store's security feed system, to a number that had been registered to the store for purposes of loss prevention, a number that was currently saved in a phone in a car parked 3 blocks away. Lily had been watching. She watched the way she watched everything, with the stillness of a child who has learned that adults don't always notice when they're being observed, and that the most interesting things happen when they think they're not. She had watched the old woman, and she had watched her father, and she had watched the man in the suit jacket behind them, who was now staring at his phone with aggressive disinterest. When the woman left, Lily looked at her father. Daniel was already processing the next customer, moving with the same steady efficiency, as if nothing had happened. "Dad, Lily, I'm working." "I know, I just..." She stopped. Then, "That was nice." He glanced at her over the lane divider. "Put your headphones on if it's too loud in here." But he was, she noticed, standing slightly straighter than he had been before. What Daniel did not consider, in the moment, was the cost. He registered it mathematically. $11 removed from the wallet. $11 that had been designated for gas on Sunday. And he registered it the way he registered most small losses, which is to say, as a problem to be solved later rather than a problem to feel anything about now. This was, in general, how he operated. The emotional accounting could wait. The practical accounting was more urgent. What he also did not consider, because there was no reason to, was the fact that Eleanor Whitfield had spent the morning on the phone with her daughter describing her plan to stop by Kellerman's on her way home from her eye appointment, and that her daughter, who was, among other things, meticulous about follow-through, had made a note of this. Or that Eleanor, now standing at the bus stop outside with her bags of groceries, was sending a text message in the slow, deliberate manner of someone who had learned to text late in life and still gave every word its full attention. Or that the text read, in full, "A young man named Daniel at Register 4 just paid the difference when my card declined. He wouldn't take it back. Reminded me of your father. Thought you should know, Eleanor was not, in general, a person who sent unsolicited messages. She called when she had something specific to say, texted when a call felt excessive, and considered most of what passed through people's phones to be noise dressed up as information. She had sent this text because it was the kind of thing small, specific, human, that she had long ago learned her daughter needed to hear. Nadine ran on data. She made decisions with precision and moved through the world at a speed that Eleanor admired and occasionally worried about. But underneath the precision there was, Eleanor knew, a person who was still looking for evidence that kindness existed in the places she couldn't control. Eleanor sent it because she thought her daughter deserved to know. These were things Daniel had no way of knowing. He was scanning a box of cereal and asking a small child if she wanted to help press the total button on the keypad, because children generally liked this, and she did, and she pressed it with great seriousness. Mr. Hargrove was standing at the end of the lane. Mercer. Daniel looked up. The store manager was standing 6 feet away, with his arms folded, and an expression that had moved past disapproval into something more formal. In 3 years, Daniel had learned to read this expression. It meant paperwork. Mr. Hargrove, step to the side for a minute. Daniel told the current customer he'd be right back and moved out from behind the register. Lily watched from her chair with the careful neutrality of a child who has learned when to be invisible. I saw what you did, Hargrove said. His voice was flat and even, which was worse than when he was loud. I helped a customer complete her transaction. You reached into the register and supplemented a cash transaction with personal funds in a way that circumvents standard. I put money into the drawer, Daniel said. The drawer balanced. The transaction was completed accurately. That's not the point, Mercer. Then what is the point? Hargrove's jaw tightened. He did not like being interrupted. He did not like Daniel's particular brand of calm, which had always read to him as insubordination wearing the disguise of cooperation. The point is that you created a precedent. You made a decision that isn't yours to make. You introduced personal funds into company transactions, which is a terminable offense under the employee conduct. You're firing me. The words came out flat, not as a question, just as an identification of what was happening. Hargrove straightened. I'm terminating your employment for violation of company policy. Your final check will be processed within 72. In front of my daughter, the sentence hung there. Several customers in nearby lanes had stopped moving. The teenage boy at the self-checkout glanced over. The woman who'd been behind Eleanor in line stood holding her cart handle and looking at the floor. Hargrove said, I'd recommend you keep your voice. I am keeping my voice, Daniel said. Very quietly. I'm just noting that you chose to do this in public, in front of my 8-year-old child. Because you could. The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was the silence of people who know they are watching something unfair and are hoping someone else will decide what to do about it first. Hargrove held out his hand. Your badge. Daniel unclipped it from his apron. He set it in Hargrove's hand with the same steady deliberateness with which he did everything else. And then he folded the apron and set it on the edge of the counter and walked back to the chair where Lily was sitting. She had closed her workbook. She was looking at him with an expression that she was working very hard to keep still. Hey, Bug. He crouched down to her level. We're going to head out now. Okay, she said, in a very small voice that wasn't okay at all. He lifted her backpack and held out his hand, and she took it. The walk from Register 4 to the front doors of Kellerman's grocery was approximately 40 feet. It took Daniel and Lily about 30 seconds. It felt considerably longer than that. He was aware, in the peripheral way of someone who has decided not to look, that people were watching. A woman near the magazine rack had her phone held at an angle that suggested she was filming. A stock boy he'd worked alongside for a year was standing with his hand on a shelf, not moving. Two women by the floral display were talking in low voices. Daniel looked at none of them. He kept his eyes at the level of the exit doors and held Lily's hand and walked at a pace that was not hurried and not slow. The pace of a man who is choosing the manner of his leaving, even if he could not choose to leave. Lily walked beside him without speaking. She was gripping his hand harder than usual. He could feel the small bones of her fingers, the slight tremor she was suppressing with the controlled effort of a child who has decided that this is not a place or a time for crying. He thought about what he had in the bank. He thought about whether the dry cleaning job would give him more hours if he asked, about whether the notice period on rent was 30 or 45 days, about whether he'd been smart enough to put the car insurance on autopay, or if that was something that still required a manual payment. He thought these things not because they were more important than what was happening emotionally, but because they were more manageable, and management was what he had. Lily was quiet beside him with the quality of quiet that children have when they are working hard to hold something still inside themselves. He had learned, in 8 years, to read her silences the way other parents read expressions. This silence was the one that meant she understood more than she was being given credit for, and was deciding whether to let him know it. She was processing, which was what she did when things were large. She had never been a child who cried easily. She had been, from very early, a child who watched first and responded second, which was both a comfort and an occasional source of concern to Daniel, who sometimes wished she would simply cry, if she needed to, instead of running the internal calculation of whether crying was warranted. He squeezed her hand once. She squeezed back. The automatic doors registered their approach and slid open. The cool air came in off the parking lot. The sound of the store, the music, the scanner beeps, the ambient noise of 300 people going about their Friday evening fell behind them. They stood just inside the threshold for a moment, not quite outside yet. While Daniel took a breath. "Are we okay?" Lily asked. He looked down at her. She was looking up at him with her mother's eyes in a face that was otherwise entirely his own. And he thought, not for the first time, that she deserved better circumstances than she had been given, and that he was going to get her there anyway. "Yes," he said. "We're okay." And then the doors, which had begun to close, slid back open. She came through the entrance the way money tends to move through the world, with a quietness that draws more attention than noise would have. The coat was real cashmere. The shoes were Italian. The leather bag over her shoulder was the kind that didn't advertise its brand, because it didn't need to. She was in her late 40s, with the kind of face that was attractive in a way that had more to do with structure and attention than with youth. Her hair was dark, cut cleanly at the jaw. She wore no jewelry except small gold earrings, and she moved through the entrance without hesitation, without the slight pause most people made to adjust to the brightness of a new space. She paused just inside the entrance the way people do when they are orienting, not uncertain, just taking inventory. Her eyes moved across the checkout area, the lanes, the customer service desk, the promotional display near the entrance that had been up for 3 weeks past its intended replacement date. She was, Daniel would later understand, doing what she always did in retail spaces, reading the store the way a doctor reads a patient, looking at the signs that told you about the health of the underlying system. The outdated display was a symptom. The understaffed lane at the far end was a symptom. She noted them both in the time it took most people to simply locate the carts. She looked at Daniel and Lily. Then she looked at the folded green apron under Daniel's arm. Then she looked, briefly, at the checkout area, where Mr. Hargrove was standing in conversation with a woman from the customer service desk, looking at something on his phone. She turned back to Daniel. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was moderate and unhurried. "Is your name Daniel?" He blinked. "Yes." "Register for?" A pause. "Yes." She looked at the apron again, at Lily. Then she said, with a measured precision that suggested she was choosing her words exactly, "My mother texted me 40 minutes ago about a man named Daniel at Register 4. I came as quickly as I could." Lily looked up at her father. He was standing very still. "I'm Nadine Whitfield," the woman said. "Eleanor is my mother." The doors had now fully opened around them, the way doors open when something is about to start rather than end. Nadine Whitfield was the managing director and majority shareholder of Whitfield Capital Group, which owned, among other assets, a consumer retail portfolio that included 3 grocery chains in the Mid-Atlantic region. One of those chains was in the process of being evaluated for acquisition. The chain under evaluation was Kellerman's parent company, Benford Retail Corp. She did not immediately say any of this. What she said first was, "My mother doesn't ask for help. She never has. She grew up in circumstances where asking for help was a sign of failure. And 74 years later, she still carries that." She paused. "So when she texts me to say that someone at a grocery store paid for her groceries without being asked and wouldn't accept anything in return, that means something to me." They were standing slightly to the side of the entrance, out of the main traffic flow. Lily had, at some point, moved slightly behind her father's leg in the way children do when adults are being significant. "She didn't tell me you were fired," Nadine said. "I don't think she knew. But when I walked in and saw..." She stopped. "Who made that decision?" Daniel said nothing, but his eyes moved briefly in the direction of Hargrove, who had noticed by now that something was happening near the entrance and was walking toward them with the expression of a man who manages by proximity. Hargrove arrived with a retail smile already prepared. "Good evening. Is there something I can help you? You fired this man." The smile adjusted slightly. "I'm sorry. Are you, for paying the difference on a cash transaction," Nadine said, "for a customer who was short, with his own money." Hargrove's tone shifted into the register he reserved for difficult customers, patient, condescending, lightly aggrieved. "Ma'am, I understand this may appear..." "I'm not interested in how it appears," Nadine said. "I'm interested in whether it happened." "Did it happen?" "A beat. Company policy requires." That wasn't a complicated question. The checkout area had gone quiet in the specific way of a space where everyone is pretending to do something other than listen. The teenage boy at self-checkout had given up on pretending entirely. This was the thing about Nadine Whitfield that people who only knew her professionally sometimes misunderstood. She was not performing authority. She had spent 20 years in rooms where authority was performed, where voices got louder, and postures got larger, and language got more technical to compensate for the absence of actual clarity. She had learned early that the opposite approach was more efficient. You said the plainest version of what was true, in the quietest voice that would still be heard, and you let the plainness of it do the work. Hargrove had spent 19 years in retail management, where emotional volume was a standard tool. He had no framework for someone who didn't use it, Hargrove said, with visible effort at dignity. The employee created a financial irregularity in a cash transaction. He put $11 of his own money in the drawer, Daniel said, very quietly, so a 74-year-old woman could take her groceries home. Nadine looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Hargrove. "I see," she said. What happened next unfolded in the particular way that only becomes clear in retrospect, the sequence of dominoes that, once the first one falls, makes the rest feel inevitable. Though at the moment of the first fall there is still the sense that things could have gone any number of ways. Nadine took her phone from her coat pocket and made a call. She did not step away to make it, which meant that Hargrove heard one side of a conversation that lasted 2 minutes and 17 seconds. She said, "It's Nadine. I need everything on the Benford retail evaluation sent to my phone in the next 15 minutes. And I need Marcus to know I'm at the Kellermans on Fairview Avenue." A pause. "No, tonight. I'll explain later." She put the phone back in her pocket. Hargrove was a man of moderate intelligence who had been in retail management for 19 years. And there was a specific look that crossed his face in that moment. Not panic, not shame, but a rapid internal recalculation of the kind that happens when context shifts faster than preparation allows. "Whitfield Capital," he said. His voice had changed registers. "Yes, you're evaluating Benford Retail." "We are." He looked at Daniel. He looked at Lily, who was still standing slightly behind her father's leg, watching this with the focused attention of a child who knows she is watching something she will remember. Hargrove said, with the quality of a man who knows the situation has changed, but hasn't yet identified the right next move. I may have acted precipitously. You fired a man in front of his child for being kind to an elderly customer, Nadine said. She was not loud. She was not sharp. She was simply and exactly factual, which was in some ways worse. The termination will be reversed and his record cleared. He'll receive back pay for any shift hours affected. That's not technically within your authority at this. Mr. Shi looked at his badge. Mr. Hargrove, you are currently employed by a company that is, as of this morning, in active acquisition negotiations, with a firm of which I am the managing director. I would encourage you to think carefully about the next sentence you choose. The silence had weight. It was the kind of silence that arrives after something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Not because it was unkind or untrue, but because it closed a door that had been standing open. Hargrove's 19 years of experience in managing difficult customer interactions had provided him with a very specific toolkit. And none of the tools were designed for this. His face moved through several expressions in quick succession. The authoritative one, then the placating one, then the one that was trying to locate an exit from the situation with some dignity still attached. He did not find it. Several of the nearby staff had now stopped working altogether. The young woman from the deli counter, a college student named Britt, who had worked alongside Daniel for 8 months, and who had liked him because he always said good morning first and never made her feel stupid for asking questions. She was standing with her arms folded near the prepared foods section, watching. She had been the one who'd turned to look away when Hargrove fired him 20 minutes ago. She was not looking away now. The stock boy by the paper goods aisle had stopped even pretending. A woman near the florist display was holding her phone at the particular angle that records video. 3 customers who had been heading toward the exit had stopped moving. Hargrove said nothing. Nadine turned to Daniel. I'll need someone to walk me through this store. Store-level managers are always more useful than executive briefings for acquisition assessments. Would you be willing to do that? Daniel looked at her for a moment. Then he said, I should probably put my apron back on first. Something shifted briefly in Nadine Whitfield's expression. It might have been, under other circumstances, a smile. Yes, she said. I think you should. He put it on. He folded the straps behind his back, the way he had done 5 days a week for 3 years. The muscle memory of it so embedded that his hands moved without instruction. Hargrove stood nearby with the expression of someone who is watching the last opportunity for a different outcome pass and cannot locate the words to intercept it. He said nothing. Nobody said anything. The store had the quality of a room where the furniture had all been rearranged while everyone was looking elsewhere, and people were still adjusting to where things now stood. The woman from the deli counter, Britt, caught Daniel's eye across the checkout area and gave him the smallest possible nod. He returned it. These were the kinds of exchanges that don't appear in any company record, but that constitute the actual texture of what it means to work alongside people. They walked the store for 40 minutes. Daniel carried his apron folded over one arm and spoke about Kellerman's, with the knowledge of a man who had worked every section of it at some point or another, the inventory backlog in dry goods, the staffing gap on Tuesday afternoons, the fact that the loading dock scheduling system hadn't been updated in 3 years and caused downstream delays that nobody above floor level appeared to be tracking. Lily walked between them, initially silent, and then, when it became clear that Nadine was genuinely interested in what she observed, gradually more present. She pointed out that the cereal aisle lighting was flickering near the far end, which Daniel had reported twice, to no response. She noted that the organic produce section had a layout that made it genuinely hard to find items, which she had figured out because she sometimes helped her father shop on weekends. Nadine listened to both of them without the specific variety of executive attention that is actually just waiting for the other person to finish speaking. She asked real questions. She took notes on her phone with both thumbs, old-fashioned and methodical. At the end of the walk, they stood near the back of the store by the staff corridor. The 40 minutes had been, in a technical sense, a store assessment. Nadine had asked about shrinkage rates, vendor lead times, and the overnight restocking workflow, and Daniel had answered from the ground-level knowledge of someone who had watched the store operate across 3 years and 2 management changes and 4 different configurations of the self-checkout area. But it had also been, in some harder-to-categorize sense, a conversation about how people worked, about what it meant to manage a physical space that hundreds of people moved through every day, carrying their own concerns and their own constraints and their own particular forms of urgency. Daniel talked about customers the way someone talks about people they have actually paid attention to. Nadine listened with the stillness of someone taking notes on more than just the operational data. "You have an unusual working knowledge of this place," Nadine said to Daniel. "I've been here 3 years. You also have a daughter who would make a very good retail analyst in about 15 years. Lily, who had been pretending to examine a display of reusable bags, looked up with an expression that was professionally neutral, except for her eyes. Nadine said, "I have a regional operations coordinator position that's been open for 4 months. I've been waiting for the right person. The honest truth is that the right person is someone who understands how a store actually operates from the inside, who communicates without noise, and who makes decisions based on what's correct rather than what's expedient." She let this sit for a moment. "I'd also be straightforward with you. The salary would be a significant change from what you're currently earning. There would be a probationary period. I don't offer things I don't intend to follow through on." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate that," he said. "But I need to understand what the job actually is before I say yes to anything. I have a daughter and 2 jobs and very specific obligations, and I don't change my situation without knowing what I'm changing it to." Nadine nodded once. "That's exactly the right response." "I know," he said. Then, because he understood that this was also important, "But I'm interested." Lily had moved close enough to her father's side to press her shoulder against his arm, not looking at either of them. "There's one other thing," Nadine said. She reached into her bag and took out a card, plain, white, nothing on it except a name and a number. "My mother would like to have you and Lily for dinner. She makes, apparently, very good chicken soup. She wanted me to ask rather than just send a message because she felt that was more appropriate." Daniel looked at the card. How did she know about Lily? She noticed. She noticed everything. She always has. He took the card. Lily, who was pretending not to be paying attention with complete dedication, was absolutely paying attention. He looked at the card a moment longer. It was plain white. The kind that costs more to produce than the ones with logos and colors. Because the plainness is itself a kind of statement. He thought about what Eleanor had said to him at the register, "Roy ser ko ngui tra un con." Except she hadn't said it in Vietnamese. She had said it in English, in the warm, matter-of-fact way of someone making an observation rather than a promise. "Someone will pay it back to you, young man." He had not believed it at the time, because he was not a man who organized his actions around the expectation of return. He had put $11 in the drawer because it was the right thing to do and for no other reason. But here, in the back of this store, with the hum of the refrigeration units and Lily's shoulder pressed against his arm and a business card in his hand, he found himself thinking that Eleanor might have known something he didn't. Not about karma or fate or any of the larger frameworks people use to make sense of how things unfolded. Just about the particular way that a single decent action, seen by the right person at the right moment, could redirect the current of a life. It didn't always work that way. He knew that. Most of the time it didn't. But sometimes the geometry lined up. And a Friday evening in a grocery store became something else entirely. 3 months later, Daniel Mercer was working out of a small office on the 4th floor of Whitfield Capital's Mid-Atlantic Operations Center, a title on his door that said Regional Operations Coordinator, and a desk covered in the annotated floor plans and inventory reports and staff scheduling analyses that had, in those 3 months, become the primary language in which he thought about his days. He was, his colleagues agreed, unusually good at this work. He was precise. He communicated clearly. He had the specific quality of attention that distinguishes useful analysis from performance. He had given up the dry cleaning job in the 2nd week of October. He had not replaced it with anything. This was the strangest part, the absence of a second job. The fact that the numbers balanced on one income, the odd lightness of a Friday evening that did not require him to be somewhere else by 6:30. Lily was at the same school, with the same teacher, eating school lunch that was now paid for without the careful redistribution of funds that had preceded it. She had started a book club with 3 classmates that met on Tuesdays after school in the library. She had recently informed Daniel that she was thinking about becoming either a civil engineer or a marine biologist, and asked him whether he thought these were compatible career paths. He had told her they were, that in his experience, almost everything was compatible if you were systematic about the arrangement. She had written this down. Eleanor Whitfield made chicken soup. She had made it twice, once in October, when Daniel and Lily came for Sunday dinner at the small house in Merrifield, where she had lived for 30 years, and once in November, when the weather turned and Eleanor called to say that soup weather required soup, and she had made too much for one person. Both dinners lasted longer than planned. Eleanor had opinions about the news, about architecture, about the proper way to teach long division, which she and Lily discussed at considerable length, and about most other things, and she shared these opinions with the directness of someone who had long since stopped editing herself for social comfort. Nadine came to the November dinner. She arrived slightly late, and with a bottle of wine, she set on Eleanor's counter without ceremony, and an apology for the traffic on Route 7 that was delivered with the brisk efficiency of someone who does not enjoy being late, had spent the drive cataloging the reasons why. Eleanor told her the soup had been keeping for 20 minutes, and it was fine. Nadine sat down, removed her coat, and accepted the bowl her mother set in front of her, and for a few minutes she was not a managing director or a majority shareholder, or the person whose phone had not stopped emitting notifications since Tuesday's board meeting. She was Eleanor Whitfield's daughter, eating soup in the kitchen she had grown up in, at the table she had done her own homework at 35 years ago. Daniel noticed this transition in her, the way it happened in the first few minutes at the table, and he did not comment on it because it was not the kind of thing you commented on. But he noted it. She and Daniel spent most of it at the kitchen table after Eleanor and Lily had migrated to the living room to argue about long division. They talked about the Benford acquisition, which was progressing. They talked about the operational problems he'd identified in the first month that had turned out to be systemic rather than isolated. They talked, at some point, about why he had paid for Eleanor's groceries, not the surface-level answer but the real one, which had to do with a specific afternoon in his own life. Years earlier, when someone had done something small for him that had mattered more than the person could have known. Nadine listened without interrupting. This, Daniel had come to understand, was her most consistent quality. She listened the way she did everything else, completely. He drove home that evening with Lily asleep in the back seat, her cheek pressed against the window, her math workbook open on the seat beside her. He stopped at a red light on Aldrich Street, 2 blocks from the apartment, and sat in the quiet of the car with the engine idling. He thought about Eleanor's house, the kitchen with the low ceiling, and the yellow curtains, and the photographs arranged on the mantelpiece in the front room, which he had glanced at on the way to the bathroom. A man who looked like Nadine in younger decades, a wedding portrait, Nadine at what appeared to be a graduation, and one photograph, slightly apart from the others, of Eleanor herself standing at the top of what might have been a mountain trail, squinting into strong light, with an expression of uncomplicated satisfaction. He had been struck by that photograph, in the way you are sometimes struck by images of people being entirely themselves, not performing a self, not managing one, just being it. He thought about what it meant that she had described him to her daughter as someone who reminded her of her late husband. He didn't know what kind of man William Whitfield had been, but he thought it was probably a good kind, because Eleanor had said it like a fact rather than a compliment. And Eleanor, in the weeks since that Friday, had not struck him as a woman who said things she didn't mean. He thought about Hargrove. Briefly, the man had resigned 2 weeks after the Kellerman's incident. Not from corporate pressure, but from the smaller, more persistent pressure of working in a store where everyone present that Friday now knew what he had done. He had taken a position with another retail chain in another city. Daniel didn't think about him often. He thought about the cashier who had replaced him at Register 4, a young woman named Courtney, who was, from what Daniel had heard through the Kellerman staff he stayed in touch with, genuinely good at the job. She had apparently started keeping a chair behind the register for her own reasons, which were nobody's business but her own. The store's new floor manager, promoted from within, had looked at the chair on her first day and said nothing about it. Daniel thought this was probably an improvement. He thought about what Lily had said to him on the drive home from Kellerman's that evening, after they'd left Nadine's card on the passenger seat between them and driven away in the particular silence that follows something large. She had been quiet for several blocks, and then she had said, without preface, "Dad, the old lady was right, someone was paying attention." He had not answered immediately. He had driven for another block, watching the traffic, running the numbers in his head as he always did, calculating the shape of what came next. Then he had said, "I know, Bug," and she had nodded, satisfied, and gone back to looking out the window at the city moving past. The light changed. He drove the last 2 blocks home, and the night was clear, and somewhere in the apartment above his, someone was cooking something that smelled like garlic and good bread, and Lily shifted in her sleep, and her book slid from the seat to the floor. And he made a note to pick it up when they parked, which he did. And he carried it inside, along with everything else. The ordinary weight of a life that was, quietly and without announcement, becoming something better than it had been.